Hey there, everybody. I've just got one question for you all tonight. Have you ever wanted to camp, but you can't? You're allergic to nature and you don't have a tent. Well, I've got good news. You can camp while in bed in a virtual space we'll plug into your head. It's Least Haunted Campfire Club. Yes, the Least Haunted Campfire Club. Give us the keys, we'll open our scary door. Sight, sound, and even taste if you make yourself a s'more. This is the new reality the Least Haunted has you. Let's tell ghost stories around some digital plasma.
Long ago, it may have been centuries, or it may as well have been only a few decades. Time is fluid in stories. Either way, it wasn't now, and it wasn't here. Unless, if for you, here is the region of Brittany in France, in which case it wasn't now, but for you, it is here. Glad we've got that all straightened out. Where was I? So, sometime before now, and in a place that wasn't here, except that it was Brittany in France, three friends were walking back to a farmhouse. They were returning from a late night's revelry at the local village tavern. It was dark. Darkness is a prerequisite for stories such as this, and required to fit with the narrative. Otherwise, you have a tale of three drunks stumbling down a dirt country road in the full light of afternoon, and that story is a comedy, or at least a statement on alcoholism, and maybe just a little bit sad? But this is a scary story, and so we set it at night. But don't forget the less than full moon, gibbous, as Lovecraft would call it. It is important that it isn't too dark, otherwise no one could see what was happening in the story, and too much moonlight, and this could easily become a love story. Right. Anyway, there were three men walking down a dark country road at night with only the light of a 3/4 moon to show their way. Luckily, the road was a busy one by day, and so there were heavy ruts in the dirt lane that aided them in their travel, like boozy marbles rolling down a toy track. As they were walking along, they were trading drunken boasts about their various exploits in a vain attempt to convince themselves of their own masculinity and strength. They were those type of guys. Soon, however, in the silence between their drunken proclamations, a sound could be heard. A slight creaking. Quiet at first, but as their walk went on and the distance between them and the town grew wider, but the distance between them and their final destination grew shorter, the creaking became louder and more noticeable in the silence of the breaks of their conversation. The reason we needed the particularly full moon was for this moment. In the blue-black darkness ahead of them, they could soon see the darker shape of a cart on the road. A larger shadow in a shadowed world. A shadow that swallowed up the small bit of moonlight that lit their way. It wasn't long before their inebriated stumbling and ambling actually allowed them to nearly overtake the cart. Now closer, they could see that it was a simple handcart, being pulled along by a hunched-over cloaked figure. The creaking of the wooden wheels filled the air. The silhouette of the drover against the lighter surroundings made it apparent that the figure wore a broad-brimmed hat. I mentioned that the three men were the type given to what we in the here and now, unless you're in Brittany and France, in which case I don't know, but in the here and now that I occupy, would call toxic masculinity. But that wasn't completely true. One of the three fellows was not exactly like his friends. In fact, friends wouldn't even really be the word that he would use to describe his companions. Friends were the people you chose to surround yourself with, and when your choice is significantly diminished through factors of geography and the limited population of rural France long ago, you took what you could get. So when two of the liquidly brave men began to throw rocks and harass the seemingly elderly man pulling the cart, the third held back and chose the role of awkward bystander, and suddenly found the nearly invisible ground at his feet incredibly fascinating, even though he couldn't see it in the dark. The cart puller made no attempt to defend themselves. They just continued to pull their cart along and ignored the jeers and small stone projectiles. Cruel people and bullies hate nothing more than being ignored. There is something about the stoically non-violent that fills assholes with boiling hot rage. Remember this, if you take nothing else away from the story. People who treat other people like objects will perceive being ignored as either validation of their behavior or as a challenge to go further. But likewise, being confronted also yields the exact same results, so make of that what you will. When the cart puller ignored the drunken cruelty, the two men decided to escalate the encounter. They took to attacking the cart directly, loudly kicking and rocking the small wooden cart with whoops and hollers that would have required a fluency in alcohol to accurately translate or understand. Until one of them, not important which, only that it was not the third who continued to not get involved, but one of the other two, kicked the cart from the side so viciously that it rocked so far as to lose a brief battle with gravity and topple over. The event punctuated by a wooden crack snap that could only have been an ancient wooden cart axle breaking in the darkness. The sound of the cart breaking seemed to satisfy whatever eager cruelty burned within the two men, and having their appetite for willful destruction and harassment satiated, decided to stumble on down the road to terrorize the rest of the darkness between them and their waiting beds. The third man now found himself rather more awkwardly standing in the middle of the road as the dark shrouded figure with the broad-brimmed hat began the shadow puppet performance of trying to right the cart. Surprisingly, the man found himself beginning to move, and was more surprised to soon find himself aiding in the effort. He could make out that the axle was indeed broken by the odd angle of one of the wooden wheels. As luck would have it, this young man actually had experience with mending the carts and wheelbarrows of the farm, and so he quickly began to search the dark side of the road, using the light of the not full moon to search for an appropriate branch or stick. His search was fruitful, and in a few minutes' time he found himself kneeling beside the cart working on performing emergency maintenance on the ancient wooden vessel. He thought it odd that the entire time the cart puller had uttered not a single word, not even so much as a grunt, as they had lifted the weight of the cart, and stood there holding the broken cart aloft so that the young man could struggle with the makeshift axle. Once he was satisfied that the replacement wood branch axle would be enough to at least see the cart puller as far as the next town for a proper repair, he stood up. He brushed the clay-like dirt of the roadside off of his hands on the knees of his pants, and he turned to the cart puller prepared to utter some form of apology, but the words never formed in his throat. The not full moon, so important to the narrative of this story, had dropped in the sky low enough that it now cast its pale blue light at a different angle, allowing the man to see under the wide-brimmed hat for the first time. He quickly fled down the road in terror back the way he had come, back to the village, and not to the farm, not that way, not where that cart was headed. The next day, the two young men who had broken the cart didn't arrive for their morning chores. They were found dead in their beds. Some might say they had aspirated on drunken vomit in the night, but the third man knew different. As for him, he had been found in the morning, curled up on the doorstep of the church. His hair had turned completely white and brittle. As white and brittle as the hair that had framed the ancient and bone-like face that he had seen under that broad-brimmed hat in the dim moonlight, glowing in the darkness like a lighthouse on some far, distant rocky shore.
It was quite by accident I discovered this incredible invasion of Earth by life forms from another planet. As yet, I haven't done anything about it. I can't think of anything to do. I wrote the government, and they sent back a pamphlet on the repair and maintenance of frame houses. Anyhow, the whole thing is known. I'm not the first to discover it. Maybe it's even under control. I was sitting in my easy chair, idly turning the pages of a paperback book someone had left on the bus, when I came across the reference that first put me on the trail. For a moment, I didn't respond. It took some time for the full import to sink in. After I'd comprehended, it seemed odd I hadn't noticed it right away. The reference was clearly to a non-human species of incredible properties not indigenous to Earth. A species, I'd hasten to point out, customarily masquerading as ordinary human beings. Their disguise, however, became transparent in the face of the following observation by the author. It was at once obvious the author knew everything, and was taking it in his stride. The line, I tremble remembering it even now, read, "His eyes slowly roved about the room." Vague chills assailed me. I tried to picture the eyes. Did they roll like dimes? The passage indicated not. They seemed to move through the air, not over the surface, rather rapidly, apparently. No one in the story was surprised. That's what tipped me off. No sign of amazement at such an outrageous thing. Later, the matter was amplified. His eyes moved from person to person. There it was in a nutshell. The eyes had clearly come apart from the rest of him and were on their own. My heart pounded and my breath choked in my windpipe. I had stumbled onto an accidental mention of a totally unfamiliar race. Obviously non-terrestrial, yet to the characters in the book it was perfectly natural, which suggested they belonged to the same species. And the author? A slow suspicion burned in my mind. The author was taking it rather too easily in his stride. Evidently he felt this was quite a usual thing. He made absolutely no attempt to conceal this knowledge. The story continued. Presently, his eyes fastened on Julia. Julia, being a lady, had at least the breeding to feel indignant. She is described as blushing and knitting her brows angrily. At this, I sighed with relief. They weren't all non-terrestrials. The narrative continues. Slowly, calmly, his eyes examined every inch of her. Great Scott! But here the girl turned and stomped off, and the matter ended. I lay back in my chair, gasping with horror. My wife and family regarded me with wonder. "What's wrong, dear?" my wife asked. I couldn't tell her. Knowledge like this was too much for the ordinary, run-of-the-mill person. I had to keep it to myself. "Nothing," I gasped. I leapt up, snatched the book, and hurried out of the room. In the garage, I continued reading. There was more. Trembling, I read the next revealing passage. He put his arms around Julia. Presently, she asked him if he would remove his arm. He immediately did so, with a smile. It's not said what was done with the arm after the fellow had removed it. Maybe it was left standing upright in the corner. Maybe it was thrown away. I don't care. In any case, the full meaning was there, staring me straight in the face. There was a race of creatures capable of removing portions of their anatomy at will. Eyes, arms, and maybe more, without batting an eyelash. My knowledge of biology came in handy at this point. Obviously, they were simple beings, unicellular, some sort of primitive single-celled things, being no more developed than starfish. Starfish can do the same thing, you know. I read on, and came to this incredible revelation, tossed off coolly by the author without the faintest tremor. Outside the movie theater, we split up. Part of us went inside, part over to the cafe for dinner. Binary fission, obviously. Splitting in half and forming two entities. Probably each lower half went to the cafe, it being further, and the upper halves to the movies. I read on, hands shaking. I had really stumbled into something here. My mind reeled as I made out this passage. I'm afraid there's no doubt about it. Poor Bibney had lost his head again. Which was followed by, and Bob says he had utterly no guts. Yet Bibney got around as well as the next person. The next person, however, was just as strange. He was soon described as totally lacking in brains. There was no doubt of the thing in the next passage. Julia, whom I had thought to be the one normal person, reveals herself as being an alien life form, similar to the rest. Quite deliberately, Julia had given her heart to the young man. It didn't relate what the final disposition of the organ was, but I didn't really care. It was evident that Julia had gone right on living in her usual manner, like all the other characters in the book, without heart, arms, eyes, brains, viscera, dividing up in two when the occasion demanded, without a qualm. Thereupon, she gave him her hand. I was sickened. The rascal now had her hand as well as her heart. I shudder to think what he'd done with them by this time. He took her arm. Not content to wait, he had started dismantling her on his own. Flushing crimson, I slammed the book shut and leapt to my feet, but not in time to escape one last reference to those carefree bits of anatomy whose travels had originally thrown me on the track. Her eyes followed him all the way down the road and across the meadow. I rushed from the garage, back inside the warm house, as if the accursed things were following me. My wife and children were playing Monopoly in the kitchen. I joined them and played with frantic fervor, brow feverish, teeth chattering. I had had enough of the thing. I want to hear no more about it. Let them come. Let them invade Earth. I don't want to get mixed up in it. I have absolutely no stomach for it. That was The Eyes Have It by Philip K. Dick, originally published in Science Fiction Stories 1953. So I think that might just wrap it up for this first Campfire Club. We'll see y'all in a couple of weeks. It's the Least Haunted Campfire Club. The Least Haunted Campfire Club. Oh, it's the Least Haunted Campfire Club Picture Show.